I'm wondering what the reaction is to all of these attempts that each of our three speakers has spoken about. What is the reaction to the attempts to change this narrow white lens? How do parents react? How does the public react? How do the public respond when they're asked to make these, what for some people will be quite momentous changes in their way of thinking? I'd love to hear what each of you has to say about that.
So why don't we come to Margaret Ann first of all?
Okay. I know that when we do, and my question relates to this because I don't know to what extent this impacts in Scotland, but in October 2020, Kemi Badenoch, who was the Equalities Minister at that time, spoke in the House of Commons and said that it is illegal to teach critical race theory in schools without presenting an alternative viewpoint, and that terms like white privilege and other terms are, she didn't use the word triggering, but they should be avoided. And I know when we go into schools as CAJ, Catholic schools trust us because they know us, but they are nervous. And a lot of the parents are nervous about the language that we use and about, teaching their children that these things are going to be divisive rather than cohesive. And it's a reaction that's based upon what is being said by politicians. And we try and do training for teachers, parents, and children so that everybody's sort of getting the benefit. But it is concerning to me that people are actually nervous to hear these things, because a lot of them are convinced that to talk about race is divisive, and that if you can adopt a colorblind approach, it's more healing. It's more. It's a better way forward, and we know that it isn't. But it's concerning to me.
Nikki, then perhaps specifically in a school context, what sort of response do you see from parents?
What I would say to that question is, rather than it being about different people that have a vested interest in school, I would say the objection that you would get from this would be, it would be colour related as well. It would be from the white perspective, as opposed to, I wouldn't really distinguish between parents or staff. I would say it's something that's known as white fragility. And actually having come through this course, I've had to explore my own implicit bias. I've had to explore my own privilege. I've had to explore and own my own white fragility in becoming defensive when things are said, because as a white person, you don't have to acknowledge or see yourself as having a racial frame, because that's the way kind of racism works. So what I have been doing in school is as I've been going through the first cohort of the Building Racial Literacy programme, I've made use of staff meetings and in-service days to present a lot of what I've been learning to staff. And it was having a few staff on. Our staff is predominantly white, and we have one person of colour who is on supply with us. And due to her, and it was actually a Czech teacher and a teacher from a travelling family, through them talking about their own lived experiences in terms of what they'd experienced being involved in education, it opened up a bit of discussion, and I think staff have been receptive to it. Parents, what the next steps in school would be to do a presentation, similar to this. I think the key to this is understanding why. It's not about anybody being threatened. It's about not just telling a single story or part of a story. It's about the whole story, and that, you know, that people of colour's experiences, lived experiences, history has almost been whitewashed, you know, out of the curriculum. And therefore, we're not telling the story of the whole human race. We're telling part of it that's been kind of put in there through colonialism, through the empire, because this is the narrative we want people to know. We need to break that down. And it would be done, again, you know, with parents. I would envisage the same way as staff, in terms of looking at, you know, curricular areas. You know, there's a P2, that's 6-year-olds. They do a topic called Farm to Fork. And initially it's farms in Scotland, farms in Britain. So one of the ways we would look to explore that is, what about cocoa farmers, coffee farmers? What about the climate crisis that's affecting people in developing countries who are farming? That is so different to farm. So it's exploring and expanding that lens. And as Margaret referred to there about not talking, you know, looking at colour blindness. If there was the Channel 4 documentary that I watched was, if we have a colourblind approach, we are ignoring the lived experience of people of colour for centuries, and that's not okay. So I think it's a balance, Callum, of supporting people's understanding as to why, and then saying what we're going to do, but giving the why kind of before the how.
Thanks, Nikki. That's incredibly powerful. And then, Graham, if I can bring your thoughts in as well and maybe tie the two questions together, because I know that
they do tie together.
Definitely. And I know that in your role as a counsellor, you know, you'll have that public-facing element, certainly. So, you know, that element of how does the public respond to these matters, but also with your more kind of overarching political role, this notion of how decisions made at Westminster impact here in Scotland. So if I could ask you just to bring those together.
Well, from the council chamber, the fact, I think we were actually in the full council session that the day she made that statement. So there was much mirth and ridicule of that such a ridiculous thing could be said. For a start, we have a barrister with us, and if you obviously as a barrister, maybe you know this, but actually critical race theory, the terminology comes from people who were in law schools, African-American lawyers in law schools in the late 1980s, who came up with a theory about how to look at institutional bias in the criminal justice system. Now, of course, no school child in any part of the planet is going to be taught critical race theories, because they would have to be university educated law students to be in the position to do so. But the fact that the Virginia governor won his election based on opposition to critical race theories was a big cultural war thing at the time Kemi Badenoch made that statement. And of course, Kemi Badenoch, as a privileged upper class multi-millionairess, has been insulated from the impact of institutionalized racism by her class. And therefore, she, of course, has no sympathy whatsoever with Black working class people. I don't expect her to. Some people will feel that maybe feel betrayed by her stance. Well, you know, there's always been Black rich people who support the system that discriminates against the majority of us. There always have been, there always will be. And she's a spokesperson for white racist power structure. And that's what she is. She's a white racist. And that's what you'd expect them to say, that, you know, the anti-racism is an agenda of Paulo Freire trying to brainwash teachers into brainwashing students into cultural Marxism for anti-capitalistic purposes. Well, in my case, I plead guilty to that, but I don't think that's true of everybody else, you know, because I think we're having modularly minimal success in that project. So clearly this is nonsense, but it's a defense mechanism against the entrenched privileged power structures that woman defends and wanted to be prime minister in order to defend. So of course she will not acknowledge the slavery legacy still has an impact. Even the social science proves it. Going back to the question that was raised here from, I think it was Marion, wasn't it? That the white lens and how the public and the parents respond. My experience has been that the public responds very well to historical discussions that seem to be distant. Remember that Scotland's a country that sees itself in a very social democratic, solidaritarian, civic-minded and progressive self-identification. It's very different from the citizens of 100 and 200 years ago. They would have seen themselves as part of an empire and seen themselves very differently. Scots see themselves as enlightened people, and therefore are kind of almost horrified and offended by being seen in this way. So countering that and having an anti-slavery and abolition history is important to Scots for their own self-worth as a nation. But so I think that it's definitely the case that they respond well to those kind of historical discussions. What they do not seem to be much more defensive about, in my experience, has been the idea that something you do right now can have discriminatory consequences, and that you can be a perpetrator now of discrimination. People find that hard to accept. And until fairly recently, there was a denialism about us having a racism problem. Indeed, some education authorities would say, "Oh, we don't have any black students, so we don't have a problem with racism." That was said. I've heard it said. Thankfully, not recently, but it's now they would be laughed off the stage if they was to say such a thing now. But then the question that comes is that if you have very few people of color in your education system, does that not obligate you then still to do all the anti-racist legwork that you need to do to be a non-racist environment for those people to be comfortable in? I have to say that I experience microaggressions all the time, and it's only when I introduce myself as counselor that seems to insulate me from that impact. I went to an event just last night, and the person at the door, well-meaning, but he thought I was a member of the public. So I said, and I had to explain several times, I'm actually an invited guest of the owner of this establishment, and I then was allowed to go downstairs. But I was held at the gate as if, and it still affects me. Microaggressions affect me all the time, and if I'm getting that, and I'm the person who's nominally got some political stake within the system, that tells you just how deeply ingrained those attitudes are. And it's not just coming from white people. I have to say it's coming from other non-white people too. And my casework tells me that Asian people, Arab people, everybody else seems to think, well, at least judging by the evidence casework, that they're not quite as low down the pecking order of racism as black people are. And they may be wrong about that, but that there is that perception that at least we're not as down and graded as they are. So there is still a problem within and between cultures. And I do think that therefore the way that parents react is going to be much more important in schools. I'm very of the view that it's not just sufficient for teachers to report racist incidents and for it to be monitored at our end, looking at the reports that come to committee. I actually think that it's good that we have anti-racism clubs, many of our schools do, but I would like to see the parents more engaged and more involved in creating the school community and actually receiving the same training that the teachers are now receiving. I'm very positive and pleased that the last couple of years, over 500 school leaders in Glasgow have received this racial literacy training, and obviously more of them will get it. But I'd like to see parents and parent councils get that too, because it strikes me that when a child is doing a racial incident at a school and we report it, the whole mechanism is designed for not to excluding kids from the school. We want to keep those in, but educate them. I have to say, I think we should do much more to bring their parents in, because these attitudes often come from their parents, but they're coming from the wider culture. We can't ignore the fact that the whole culture is involved in that. So to wind up without doing another thing, I think that the impact on Scottish education of CRT is very minimal, but I think the commitment of a large number of educators out there to an actively anti-racist education system is there. And I think one of the ways we do that is by not just by talking about slavery, we actually talk about how the wider curriculum, maths involves Arab and African and Asian cultures. The numeral system is Indian, not just Arabic, it's Indian. So the origins of where our science and maths comes from can be integrated into the wider curriculum and give people another impression. Primary school kids in Albert Primary School in Glasgow, actually, because they couldn't see children's books with their faces in them and stories about them, they wrote their own. And they've done a brilliant job at filling a library full of books which have Asian, African and Chinese children and girls in particular at the forefront of the subject in the story. And seeing books that see them so you can be them is crucial to the positive development of children in our system.